Well, hello everybody. My name is Dr. Michael Carter and I'm a monastic historian at English Heritage. And I'm going to be talking to you today about the supernatural in the Middle Ages and various monastic ghost story writing. Now, belief in ghosts, as we'll see, is as old as human history, but it's changed over the centuries, and you can look at the ghost stories written by our ancestors to get very, very important insights into their their lives, their deaths, and they're very, very important historical sources, the ghost stories that I'll be talking about. But I think we'll see some threads of continuity through them, and fans of vampire literature in particular will see that although vampires are very much a creation of the Enlightenment rather than the Middle Ages, there's certainly some deep roots in belief there. So here goes. I'm showing you on the screen the dramatic ruins of Whitby Abbey's church. It predominantly dates to the 13th century, but a monastery was founded here much, much earlier, in the 650s to be precise, and that's the Anglo-Saxon age. And it was ruled by the formidable St Hilda and was a location in 664 for the Synod of Whitby. Now, this was a pivotal event in English church history, a meeting of churchmen and nobles that was there to discuss disputed aspects of church observance. And key to that was the observance of the date of Easter and how to calculate that. And we're still using to this day the method agreed at the Synod of Whitby. It was also at this monastery that Caedmon wrote the earliest surviving verse in the English language. It was a place of learning and innumerable saints, and Whitby's fame extended across Europe. Now, unfortunately, monastic life was ended here in the 9th century by Viking or Danish raiders, and it was only in the 11th century, after the Norman conquest, that monks returned. But the shell of their church is one of the glories of Gothic, and I use that in the medieval architectural sense, and we'll be encountering other uses of the word Gothic as this talk goes on. It's one of the glories of Gothic architecture in northern England and is testimony to the wealth and importance of the monastery, which was the fourth richest abbey in Yorkshire. But despite all this, it's a much later episode in the site's history. What shall I say? Literary history, that has arguably fixed it in the popular imagination. And that's the role the ruins play in an early, crucial chapter of Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's the vampire novel par excellence. Now, the Abbey is introduced at the beginning of chapter 6 in the journal of Mina Murray, and she's, of course, the novel's heroine. And I'm going to quote from this at some length. Right over the town is the ruin of Whitby Abbey, was sacked by the Danes, and which is the scene of part of Marmion, where the girl was built up in the wall. It is a most noble ruin of immense size, full of beautiful and romantic bits. There is a legend that a white lady is seen at one of its windows. Between it and the town there is another church, the parish one, around which is a big graveyard all full of tombstones. Mina's evocation of the East Cliffs as the nicest spot in Whitby would soon seem bitterly ironic. It was in the churchyard of the parish church of St Mary, the Abbey's ruins in the background, that her close friend Lucy was attacked by the blood-sucking Transylvanian count. But the image of the headland conjured up by Mina also sets it up as a place in which the evil would shortly unfold there. Well, sacked by the Danes, it was already a place of bloodshed and violence. The reference to the tombstones and the graveyard, well, that doesn't take too much imagination, does it? It's a place of death. The immurement of the girl in Walter Scott's poem Marmion, that's the nun Constance, establishes this as a place of horror. And the white lady at the window leaves the reader in no doubt that the site has supernatural associations. Now, by the time of Dracula's publication in May 1897, there was already a century-old literary tradition connecting monasteries with the Gothic and the ghastly. Monastic remains in northern England rapidly established a place in this genre. In 1794, the Gothic romancer Anne Radcliffe visited the ruins of Furness Abbey in what was then Lancashire and is now Cumbria. And in her mind's eye, Radcliffe saw an ethereal procession of Cistercian monks making their way through the church. And today there can hardly be a ruined abbey or priory anywhere in England and Wales that lacks a spooky story of an ethereal grey lady or a sinister-looking, fleetingly caught image of a hooded monk or nun. But this association with monks, monasteries and the supernatural goes back much, much earlier, in fact to the early Middle Ages. And some intriguing and at times genuinely chilling evidence is provided by monasteries in northern England under the care of English heritage. Now, between the 7th and 15th century, monastic authors in the northern counties documented numerous instances of uncanny tales. But as I seek to explain, these tales provide so much more than a pleasing terror. As a historian of medieval monasticism, I turn to them as historical documents in their own right, and sources to illuminate beliefs about death and the afterlife, the strategies available to people in the Middle Ages to secure their spiritual salvation, the enduring bonds between the living and the dead, and the interaction between elite and popular religion. And even though vampires, as we now understand them, are very much the creation of the 18th century, many of the stories I'll be discussing include elements that will be familiar to anyone who has a passing acquaintance with the vampire literature. This includes the physical characteristics of the undead, the harm which they are credited with causing, and the procedures used to protect against and ultimately vanquish these devilish beings. But belief in ghosts in some form or another can be found in most, if not all, world civilizations. They occur in Europe from the dawn of its recorded history, that's the Greek Bronze Age, and the spirits of the dead, usually in dreams, occur frequently in Homer's great epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were probably composed around 1200 years before the birth of Christ. Now, the belief in ghosts persisted in ancient Greece and Rome, and elaborate funerary rites were employed to appease the spirits of the dead to prevent them from coming back to haunt the living in the form of spectral apparitions. Now, early Christians initially took a dim view of these pagan beliefs. Christ's death on the cross and resurrection 3 days later provided for humankind the opportunity of redemption, thought to provide eternal life in the bliss of heaven, therefore vanquishing death forever. The dead, by their very nature, are not able to involve themselves in the affairs of the living, wrote St. Augustine, 4th century theologian, whose works were widely read and hugely influential throughout the Middle Ages. But despite this, there are occasional inklings that the returning dead were thought to be part of God's plan for mankind, and that ghosts were capable of a thoroughly Christian interpretation. In the 5th century, the Roman provinces of Western Europe were overrun by mainly Germanic peoples, many of whom were pagan. At the end of the 6th century, monks set about the conversion of the Anglo-Saxon peoples who'd settled in what is now England. Now, these monastic missionaries arrived in the northern kingdom of Northumbria 50 or so years after the start of the missions. Now, a main source for the conversion of the English is Bede, a monk at the monastery of St. Peter, monk Wearmouth Jarrow. He died in 735, and you can see on the screen a view of the later monastery, the later medieval monastery there. Now, Bede's ecclesiastical history of the English people is replete with accounts of miraculous holy visions. For the most part, these are of saints, the holy dead, and the accounts can be placed within, by then already well-established hagiographical traditions. But Bede's history also includes two instances that are recognisable as supernatural in stories that involve ghosts of recently deceased people, and they're appearing in apparitions. It's to a nun and a monk. But neither of these spectres is in the least bit sinister, and they have explicitly pious intentions. And I think you'd have to have an extremely nervous disposition indeed to be in the least bit spooked about them. Now, ghost stories composed by monastic authors start to proliferate from around the year 1000. Well, various reasons have been proposed for this, including the advent of the millennium and the expected second coming of Christ, when he would judge the living and the dead rising from their graves to come to judgment. The multiplication of stories around this time can also be plausibly related to the emergence of the concept of purgatory. Now, according to this, the souls of the departed were destined for one of three states. Those of people who'd lived a very holy life and didn't have the blemish of sin on their souls at the time of their death, well, they'd go straight to heaven. The souls of the wicked and those who died with unconfessed mortal or very, very serious sin on their souls, well, they're destined for the pains and everlasting fires and damnation of hell. But there was a third state called purgatory, and I think that the clue's in the name, isn't it? And that's where souls would be purged of lesser sin. Still part of Roman Catholic doctrine to this day. Now, purgatory involved punishments every bit as horrible as those meted out to souls in hell. But crucially, it's a temporary state, and there's only one way out, and that's upwards to heaven. And in this late medieval panel painting, you can see a soul being plucked out of the fires of purgatory by an angel. It served its time. Now, nobles, aware that their sins and their activities were every bit as heinous as anything depicted in Game of Thrones, founded monasteries whose communities would, in a never-ending round of services and good works, they'd pray for the salvations of the souls of their benefactors, and indeed all Christian souls, until the very end of time. Now, the amount of time a soul spent in purgatory could be shortened by the actions of the living on behalf of the deceased. That was either by doing good works, distributing charity, taking care of the sick, but especially by saying prayers and commissioning the singing of masses. Now, many of the ghost stories set down by monastic scribes were underpinned by these beliefs and the role that monks and nuns played in securing spiritual salvation. Now, these stories are actually somewhat formulaic. The ghost appears to a living person who then would express surprise, fear, but would invoke Christ and the saints for protection. But it's important to note that the ghostly apparition cannot cause either spiritual or spiritual harm. It's ethereal. It doesn't have corporeal form, bodily form. Now, the spectre returns why it's back from the dead and what spiritual services, prayers, saying of masses, are needed for the release of its soul from purgatory so it can find peace. And motivated by the spirit of Christian charity, and sometimes at great expense and effort, that the person will fulfill this task. The soul of the deceased is therefore absolved, and the ghost sometimes reappears a final time to say thank you and to confirm that it is now at rest. Now, as I said, these stories very much affirm the purpose of the monasteries, and several such stories, with a slightly different twist, were written down by a monk of Byland Abbey in Yorkshire and make these very points, and I'll be talking about them in some detail later. But we also can encounter in monastic stories a second, much more malevolent kind of supernatural being. Well, these are the restless dead, the undead. They have bodily form, rising from their grave to cause harm. Now, the modern word used to describe these supernatural beings is revenants. But in the Middle Ages, they were labelled occasionally as demons or satellites of Satan by some monastic scribes. Now, they have their origin in the malign corporeal ghosts of pre-Christian Germanic lands, Scandinavia, and of the Draugr in Icelandic sagas. And northern England was, of course, invaded and settled by these very peoples, and memory of and belief in these supernatural beings lingered, as we shall see, in these parts until the very end of the Middle Ages. Now, these revenants are difficult to reconcile with Christian beliefs about the hereafter, especially as they neither sought nor were appeased by pious prayer. Instead, the rituals of the church were called upon to provide protection against the restless dead, and extraordinary measures were needed to prevent them rising from their graves and causing harm. Now, some of the best examples can be found in the pages of the History of English Affairs, written at the end of the 12th century by one William, who was a canon of Newburgh Priory in Yorkshire. Now, it's a very, very important source for medieval historians of this period, but a text also includes numerous digressions, some of which describe supernatural occurrences. And William really did believe that what he was setting down were accounts of real recent events, and I'll quote from him. "It would not be easy," he writes, "to believe that the corpses of the dead should sally from their graves and should wander about to the terror or destruction of the living, and again return to their tombs, which of their own accord spontaneously open to receive them. Did not frequent examples occurring in our own time suffice to establish this fact, the truth of which there is abundant testimony." Now, one of William's stories is set in Berwick, a town, of course, on the border between England and Scotland and soaked in blood. It concerns a great rogue who, after his death, came forth from his grave at night, due, it was believed, to the connivance of Satan. He terrorised the townfolk before returning to his sepulchre at dawn. The authorities decided to exhume this horrible carcass, which was chopped limb from limb and thrown on the fire. Now, although the commotion caused by the restless corpse ceased, the incident was soon followed by a dreadful pestilence that carried off many of the town's inhabitants. And one of the themes that comes up again and again is the terrible smell that accompanies these reverents. And of course, in the Middle Ages, epidemic disease was thought to be spread by miasmas, often, with these devilish smells, these smells of sulphur, these smells of decay. So it's not surprising that you have this association here. And it's also interesting that in some vampire legends as well, there's a talk about the smell and a plague as well that follows vampires. Now, another of the tales is likewise, William's tales, is likewise set in northern parts and involved once again a man of evil life whose restless corpse rose from its grave to cause terror among the living. When dug up, it was discovered to be closer to the surface than expected. It's been digging its way out. And according to William, the body of the foul creature was swollen to an enormous corpulence, with its countenance beyond measure turgid and suffused with blood, while the shroud around it had been nearly torn to pieces. The heart was ripped from this revenant, its body dismembered and consigned to the flames. Now, I'm sure all of this is ringing bells for fans of modern vampire legends. Now, tangible evidence for the burning and dismemberment of the restless dead comes from the deserted medieval village of Wharram Percy, which is about 25 miles or so from Newborough. Quite a nice pastoral scene in that in the image there, doesn't it? But excavations of the site in the 1960s uncovered a pit containing a mass of human bones, and significantly, these weren't buried in the churchyard. Recent analysis showed that these remains came from a minimum of 10 individuals, and one was as young as 2 or 4 years old. Now, it was possible to show from the analysis of the bones that they were all born locally, and they lived between the year 1000 or so or 1400. The village was finally abandoned about 100 years after that. Now, discoloration of the bones showed that they came from corpses that had been burnt. Moreover, there were lots of post-mortem cut marks, and this showed that the bodies had been decapitated and dismembered. These marks also revealed that in some instances the heart had been removed from some of the bodies. Now, the pattern of post-mortem damage wasn't consistent with the butchering for cannibalism, which we know did happen at times of famine. Archaeologists instead believe that what we're dealing with here are the dismembered remains of supposed revenants, whose decapitated and burnt bodies were buried in unconsecrated ground in a liminal space just on the edge of the village. And that's something you find in vampire legends again, is the burial of the supposed vampire in a space between worlds. Now, excavations elsewhere in England and Europe have found medieval bodies where a metal stake has been used to pin a corpse to its grave, or it's been secured by the use of heavy weights. A source from the early 13th century records that Alexander Langley, prior of Wymondham in Norfolk, went mad from overstudy. He was sent to Binham Priory, that's in the same county, to live out his days, and you can see its west front there, very architecturally important west front, it must be said, there on a quite nice sunny day. Oh dear, the monks found his insane outburst utterly intolerable, and the unfortunate Langley was flogged and kept in solitary confinement. And after his death, he was buried wrapped in chains. Now, there's no Christian reason for this. You rise from your grave naked, and there's very few grave goods accompany Christian burials. So, was this to keep his unquiet body from wandering from its grave? Well, we turn to northern England. A history of the abbots of Fountains Abbey, one of the greatest monasteries of medieval England, was written in the middle of the 15th century. And this records that in 1390, Abbot William Gower was interred in the middle of the Chapel of the Nine Altars, the great eastern extension to the monastery's church, shown here. Now, the opening of this grave in the 19th century showed that the skull had been removed from the body and placed on its chest. Now, there's no evidence whatsoever that Gower was executed, and I think we'd know about that if that had been the case. And this is a typical post-mortem treatment of the corpses of supposed revenants. Now, I've got to say that stories of undead priests and monks do abound in monastic chronicles, and these include William of Newburgh's tale of a chaplain who led such a worldly life. It's included a love of hunting that he became known as the Hound Priest. He was buried at the cemetery of Melrose Abbey. That's a very important monastery in the Scottish borders. But he soon rose from his grave to the torment of the monks there. I hasten to add that there isn't any explicit evidence that Langley and Gower were counted among the restless dead in the Middle Ages. There's no contemporary description of this. But the treatment of their remains means that the possibility is at the very least worth considering. Well, shortly after the death of Abbot Gower, an anonymous monk of Byland Abbey, that's a Cistercian monastery in Yorkshire, wrote down 12 ghost stories. I'm going to consider these in some detail. They're fascinating and at times genuinely creepy, but they bring together and further illuminate many of the themes I've talked about thus far. Now, the stories occur in a manuscript from the Abbey's library, and it's now in the collections of the British Library. And it was M.R. James, who's shown there on the screen, who first brought these stories to widespread attention. James was one of the great medievalists of his day, and his many publications, including those on the illuminated manuscripts, remain an indispensable source to scholars. But James is best known for his ghost stories. Many do have a medieval inspiration. The Byland stories are all in Latin, which James described as refreshing, and I think that's probably meant to mean bad. And they're written in a crabby hand, which even an expert in medieval handwriting as talented as James found challenging at time to time. So you'll therefore, if you're interested in reading them, be relieved to know that they've been published several times. And if you want to read them online, the URL is showing at the bottom of this page now. Now, all but two of the stories are set in the fields, lanes, villages, and towns close to Byland itself. And as we'll see, one of them actually takes place within the very precincts of the monastery. Now, for the most part, the stories stand in the long tradition of monastic ghost story writing and affirm the efficacy of prayer and good works for the relief of the sufferings of souls in purgatory. And the very first story can serve as a good example. It concerns a servant of nearby Whitby Abbey, one of the great monasteries of northern England that's now in the care of English Heritage. Now, the horse of this servant was carrying a pannier full of beans, and it falls and breaks its leg. The man shoulders the beans himself and sets out on his way, only to be confronted by a spectre, which first of all takes the form of a rearing horse and then shifts into a bale of burning hay. Now, terrified, the man to whom the spectres appeared invokes the protection of Christ, and hearing this, the ghost appears in human form. It's been conjured, and it gives its name and the reason for its spiritual distress. The man arranges for masses to be said, and the ghost soul is absolved and it attains eternal rest. In some other tales, the ghost appears because it needs help to right a wrong that it hadn't been absolved for before death. Now, the sixth story involves a canon of nearby Newburgh Priory. That's Williams, the chronicle and ghost story writers. Now, this canon had died excommunicated after stealing 6 silver spoons. In order that his spirit might be absolved and find peace, it directs the man to whom it appears to find the spoons and restore them to the prior of the monastery. This is duly accomplished, and the restless spirit is absolved by the prior, and it finds rest, and it confirms in its salvation one final time by appearing to the man, and this time significantly the ghost is wearing its monastic habit. Now, the ghosts in the Byland stories were clearly considered frightening and scaring man and beast alike, and the poor protagonist of story 8 makes this point, and that was one William of Bradford. He was followed for 3 nights, according to the tale, by a ghost crying, appropriately enough for a ghost story, it's going, hoo, hoo, hoo. And on the 4th night, though, William hears a terrible cry and a voice that's getting closer and closer and closer before he's finally confronted by a pale horse, and his dog, terrified by the apparition, cowers and then hides behind William's legs. Now, William's fear and that of his hound might seem understandable, but he and the protagonists of the other stories had actually little to fear from these ghostly apparitions, especially as they could call, quite literally, upon Christ and the saints to provide protection. Now, typically, this involved invoking the holy name of Jesus, and this was a very popular devotion at this time, and one enthusiastically promoted by Cistercian monks, such as the ones who were at Byland Abbey. Likewise, the protective power of the wounds of Christ, that's his pierced hands, feet, and heart. You can see an iconographical depiction of it there on the west front of Bath Abbey. And this was a devotion very closely associated with the holy name, and it's also called upon by several of the ghosts. Now, generally speaking, these holy words generally did the trick. They forced the ghost to appear and make its request for pious services. And I'm sure that many of you will have seen the film The Exorcist, and the generally terrifying scene of the exorcism there, the rite of exorcism, often just consists of saying the names of Christ and his various manifestations, and how he's considered, and the names of saints, and commanding the unclean spirit to leave the person. And again, you can see some resonance of this in these medieval ghost stories and the protective power of holy names, the holy name of Jesus being so important and so protective. And you can understand why people in the Middle Ages held it in such reverence and would, wear little pieces of jewellery emblazoned with the IHS monogram of the holy name. Now, as I said, merely speaking these holy words did the trick. However, in story 2, the apparition is so frightening and is also said to be accompanied by devils that its human star, a tailor from Ampleforth who rejoices in the surname of Snowball, had to seek extra spiritual protection. And the formidable spiritual armour he assembles includes a book containing the 4 Gospels, amulets with sacred text written upon them, and 4 small reliquaries. The story describes how Snowball uses a crucifix to draw a circle, and that he stands in the centre of this, holding the Gospel books above him. And he's also protected by the forces of evil by the placement of 4 reliquaries at the edges of the circle to form a cross. Is that sounding familiar from reading Dracula? The ghost, which initially appears in the shape of a goat, is conjured to take human form, and that's an event that ultimately leads to the soul receiving forgiveness and repose. Now, I've mentioned on more than one occasion that the stories stand in a well-established tradition of didactic, pious, monkish ghost stories. But they also contain some novel elements and show some sort of evolution in the medieval ghost story. First of all, many of the ghosts take on a solid bodily form, even if it is in the shape of an animal rather. And several of them have shape-shifting properties. They can be pesky, and in one story they knock the crow flies at the human protagonist, knocking him over a wall, but he's saved from injury, okay. But in several of the instances, the living are left gravely ill for several days after completing the spiritual service demanded of the ghost. Now, some modern scholars think all this is showing a melding of beliefs regarding ethereal spirits with benign, pious intentions, with traditions about the undead with more malign intent. Now, the restless dead, the undead, do occur in a recognisable form in story 6, and this story concerns one James Tankerley. He'd been parish priest at the Yorkshire village of Cold Kirby. Now, the story tells how he was buried at Byland Abbey before the entrance to the chapter house. Now, that was a very, very prestigious location in which to be buried indeed, and it was normally reserved for important benefactors and people of holy life, including abbots. Well, Tankerley clearly did not deserve to be buried in such a privileged location. His body rises, we are told, from its sepulchre at night and travels the 20 miles or so to Cold Kirby, where it gouges or blows out or otherwise blinds his former concubine. So we've got another example of a revenant who's had an evil life. Now, the abbot and monks take drastic action. This wasn't an occasion for pious prayer to appease the soul of the deceased. Tankerley's body and coffin are exhumed, but rather than being chopped up and consigned to the fire, they're thrown into a nearby lake. Then, in medieval tradition, it was thought to be bottomless. And we're told also that the oxen drawing the cart on which the coffin and body have been placed, they're so frightened they nearly run into the lake themselves and drown with terror. I'd like to briefly mention one more of the Byland stories before moving on. It's the 11th tale, and it concerns a Cleveland resident called Richard Roundtree, who leaves his pregnant wife to make the pilgrimage to the shrine of St. James at Compostela in northern Spain. Well, whilst en route in Spain, he's keeping watch at night, and he sees a procession of ghosts going past, and they're all riding beasts, and these are their mortuary beasts. The animals are typically a horse, sheep, cow, which is given to the church as a gift at the time of someone's burial. And shuffling along in the wake of this procession is a small baby, and it's wrapped in a sock which has been used as a burial shroud. And the infant identifies itself as Richard's son, who's been miscarried or possibly aborted and buried without being named or baptized. Now, without baptism, the child still had the stain of original sin on its soul, and it therefore couldn't, according to official doctrine, enter the kingdom of heaven and was instead consigned to blissful limbo. However, Richard performs a kind of posthumous baptism in the name of the Trinity, and he names the child as well, therefore allowing it to stand upright and it's found salvation. Now, the inclusion of the story in the Byland collection is quite intriguing, and I think it implies official ecclesiastical sanction for the wide-scale practice of the laity performing emergency baptism on stillborn infants, so giving them the comfort of thinking that their child, born without access to the first sacrament, because it's dead, will indeed be part among, see them again in heaven, can be counted among the blessed. Now, this talk is largely focused on the didactic purposes of ghost stories, and they're placed in medieval religious and particularly monastic belief and observance. But I also think that to some extent, people in the Middle Ages then as now marvelled at and even, dare I say, enjoyed a creepy tale of the supernatural. And we've got some evidence of this from English heritage sites in northern England. One of the stories written down by the chronicler Matthew Paris of St Albans Abbey in the 13th century, it's considered a ghostly occurrence at Roach Abbey near Doncaster, and it's got some really, really beautiful ruins shown on the screen. Now, Paris recalls this event as occurring in late May 1236, when, to quote him, bands of well-armed knights riding valuable horses with standards and shields, with coats of mail and helmets, well, they emerged from the ground near the monastery and took part in a tournament lasting 3 days, and were told that, well, as you can expect, this was to the wonder of all those who beheld it. But then the chivalric host disappeared into the ground from whence they came once again. Now, I think this story would have very much appealed to the knightly classes, who were an important and very generous category of monastic benefactors. Now, tales of ghosts and demons also inhabited the pages of the 14th century chronicle that was once owned by Lanercost Priory in Cumbria. And many of them seem more suited to the campfire, to be perfectly honest, than to the use of edifying lessons in the novices' chamber or for pious reading by monks in the cloister. Even after an interval of 700 years, the account of a demon child fatally wounding a young lady who's trying to cross a river is genuinely disturbing. And well, I suppose because she receives the sacrament of confession before dying, it's showing that she died in a state of grace and therefore had the possibility of salvation. But other elements of the story, I don't see as serving any moral purpose at all. In fact, when I read it, I think the story just shows that evil was believed to be abroad in the world. Now, religious reformers of the 16th century believed that salvation was achieved through faith in Christ alone, and they rejected the value of good works and intercessory prayers for the dead. Ghosts, officially at least, had no place in this new theology. Now, Hilary Mantel's The Mirror and the Light, the last part of the Thomas Cromwell Wolf Hall trilogy contains a description of its hero who, like a good Protestant, leafs with disdain through a book he's obtained from one of the recently come down monasteries pillaged from its library. And the reason for Cromwell's disdain is that the book contains ghost stories. And Cromwell's mocking, even disparaging contents about the contents of the tales, which are given at some length, left me in no doubt that he's supposed to have had in his hands the manuscript containing the Byland Abbey ghost stories. And I think it's quite interesting that even after 600 years, they're still making this kind of literary impact. But the anti-Catholicism that you can see there in Cromwell's reaction, and also I have to say in a lot of the Wolf Hall stories of Hilary Mantel, can also be found in 18th and 19th century Gothic ghost stories and fiction. And it found its way to scholarship as well. In his translation of the Lanercost Chronicle, the antiquarian Sir Hubert Maxwell expressed disgust for the superstitious nonsense that peppered its pages and how this was used by the medieval church to keep the populace in ignorance and subjugation. And indeed, it's possible to detect something of an anti-Catholic stance in several of M.R. James's ghost stories. Well, regardless of the hopes of Protestant reformers, belief in the ghosts and the supernaturals endured and indeed flourished in Protestant England. And I think the twice yearly Goth festivals at Whitby are evidence of a thriving association between monastic ruins and the restless dead in 21st century and a largely post-Christian England. Now, the Abbey takes centre stage in these celebrations, and I'm sure you don't need this image to guess why. But I can't help smile when I think about this. As I said at the beginning of this talk, medieval Whitby was a place of saints. And one of the saints whose relics rested in the monastery was a 7th century nun called St. Begu. Her feast day falls on, you can guess, Halloween, the 31st of October. So the Goths who are flocking to Whitby Abbey at Halloween tide are following in the footsteps of medieval pilgrims who would have visited the Abbey at that day to venerate one of Whitby's greatest saints on her feast day. Now, I've shown you the importance of beliefs about holiness and the role of Christ and his saints as protecting against evil beings and the dead. And I can't just help think that had Dracula dared to land in Whitby during the Middle Ages, he just wouldn't have had a chance. Thanks so much for your attention.